You are entering the Nihilverse with your hosts Gustavo and Rodney Perry. This episode has been brought to you by the Society of Namecoin. No.
So good morning.
Good morning.
Today, this is a very interesting area for me because it is the beginning of a long discussion that we're going to have toward building a very complex and integrated model that I don't think has ever been done in any writing that I have ever seen around creativity or insight or psychology. And we will, in the end, and this is going to take us a long time, but in the end, we will have a model that knits together a way of analyzing insight, awe, and the process of kenosis that we've talked about, this kind of self-rarefying. Luckily, we have discovered that nothing is an amazing tool, and nothing holds all three of these processes together into one model. So that's just where we're going, and it's pretty interesting. So today we'll deal a little bit with insight. So one thing that we should note is that to a cosmologist, to an astrophysicist, every one of them acknowledge that insight is important in scientific discovery. And we talk a lot about the history of that. With Einstein was very much enamored with insight and a pathway to understanding and so forth, and other great scientists in history. And it's accepted that insight is essential for scientific progress. The flip side of that discussion, with all the scientists avowing that insight is important in scientific discovery, not one of them propose a sophisticated psychological analysis of what insight actually is. None of them actually say. Nothing allows us to give a very useful way of talking about how insight works. So just to go back a little bit, we talked about how scientists will tensely think about a particular problem for a long period of time. And that when they get frustrated or when they don't find any relief into that problem, they'll often use images. Images are what we call transheuristics. They help propel the scientists beyond the realm of concept. And we talked a lot about Watson and Crick, of course, and we talked about Stephen Hawking, what a genius he was in the use of images and so forth. And that these images will help a scientist sort of go beyond the realm of conception. Sometimes that's called breaking free from the paradigmatic constraints, meaning getting beyond the kind of culturally accepted way of thinking. We also talked about that as that images provide what we call an escape velocity, a way of getting out beyond the realm of concept. And so that idea of escape velocity, I think, is something that intrigued you in some way.
That's right, yeah. I have a sort of a chaoptic for it, I think, that I'd like to share with you guys when we get there.
Yeah, sure. Let's do that now.
Okay, yeah, great. So there are no guaranteed insights. It would be nice if we had like a reproducible process where we could arrive at a breakthrough by just following a set of steps. But alas, scientists or insight is not a scientific enterprise, and yet it's vital to its efficacy. So as always, I'm always interested in visualizing sort of these things to better understand. I guess that's the scientist in me sort of wanting to visualize. And this escape velocity idea is a good one, right? So let's work with it. So we begin on Earth, where all is known, measured, and processed. Remember, Earth's mass is proportional to the force needed to escape its grasp due to gravity. Force of gravity is equal to the mass of some object times the mass of Earth divided by times some constant divided by the distance between them squared. So it's proportional to the mass of the Earth. The scientist, when wanting to solve a problem, is, metaphorically speaking, in a well of its own, like a potential well, just like a gravitational well is a well, theoretically speaking. The scientist is also in a well of his own. So let's let the difficulty of the problem be analogous to the mass of the problem.
Mass is the difficulty.
The mass is the difficulty. So the scientist researches, experiments, and thinks about his problem in an effort to escape the problem's grasp so that he or she can once again be free to explore. These efforts are analogous to like booster rockets. The more effort or work done, the more power or fuel your rockets would have to have in order to carry such a dumb vessel like myself. Granted, the vessel needs to be well built such that it doesn't break up upon liftoff. But we'll assume that's the case. So the difficulty with the analogy is that although for physical rockets, we know which way we need to point them to get them into space, in that we know which way is up, for the n-dimensional flight of problem solving, we don't know which way is up.
We don't have a direction.
So exactly, the up is the goal, but we don't know what way is up. A scientist oftentimes spends all of his or her resources without any progress. They could be whizzing about parallel to the Earth without knowing it because they don't know exactly which way is up. Remember, it's easy here on Earth to know which way is up because we have 3 dimensions. If it's not one, it's not the other, then it's the other, it's last. With the n-dimensional space of problem solving, it's not so easy to determine which way is up. So at this point, the scientist needs to stop looking outwards into the world for evidence and also stop looking into their mind for resolution. They need to bow their head and nullify themselves before the ideational ground upon which their feet once stood. For what I just said, it might be good to sort of imagine yourself as a portly fellow, where you're not able to see your feet from where you stand. You can't see your feet because your belly sort of covers.
Yeah, your belly's in the way. Yeah.
Right? You need to shed some pounds to be able to see where you stand so that you know where to go. So similarly, we need to sort of shed pounds to be able to see where we stand. And in this ideational space, you need to shed all of it, essentially. You need to nullify yourself to be able to know where you stand such that you know which way is perpendicular to the plane upon which you stand. Remember, perpendicular to the place where you stand is up. So there's that. But you can also allow the pull, and I've mentioned this before in a couple of episodes, I think.
I remember.
You could also allow the pull of nothing above you to tell you which way is up. In that manner, the insight that you have could be like sort of more of an outsight because there is no longer an in. You've nullified yourself and you've just allowed nothing above you to pull you upwards, to show you the way. So regardless, instantaneously, this feeling of nothing becomes like a bolt of lightning to the mind, propelling you into the space. If you have the right escape velocity, you will be able to overcome the pull of gravity such that you'll be able to reach space and continue on to infinity or until you're trapped by another gravitational well.
Until you run into another conundrum.
That's right. Another conundrum, and you sink right into its orbit. To wrap it all up, the escape velocity then is proportional to the degree of difficulty of the problem. And by nullifying the self, so to be able to see the dimensionality of the ideational space you inhabit and allow yourself to feel the pull of nothing above, that's how I visualize nihilative knowing and how it can help scientists.
Being pulled into it.
That's right. You need to be able to see your feet or where you are and the only way you can do that is by nullifying yourself or annihilating yourself and think of your belly sort of
in the way.
See where you stand. So there it is. So it's the nothing of the self meeting the nothing above.
The work that you put into it is proportionate to the problem.
Yes. Right. So some wells are very easy to solve. It won't require a lot of energy to escape its grasp, and some wells are a lot deeper and they require a lot more of a larger jolt.
That's in a kind of an image, a way of seeing something that we added to the discussion of how insight works. Because, for instance, I mean, we looked at Lonergan and Wallace and all these sort of classic people who talk about a 4-stage process of insight. And one of the things that they mention, I mean, we went through the Watson and Crick discovery as an example of this, but the classic form that Wallace and Lonergan and so forth put forth in their 4-stage of insight is that the scientists, either alone or in conjunction with their team, they struggle and struggle and struggle and struggle and struggle until they get tired. And there's that long struggle, and that's what you were talking about, that the amount of struggle is relative to how hard the problem is. And so the struggle is very important. What the classic models of insight don't do is offer any understanding of what happens between the struggle and the insight. There's no discussion there other than, and then we've talked about, and that's what you just elucidated, kind of a losing of the pot belly and being drawn to nothing. That is the discussion that we laid out. You did it in a kind of beautiful visual way. That's the discussion that we laid out that other psychologists have not. So according to the classic model, you struggle. With the long struggle, you get fatigued and you take a break. And that break is described in all kinds of ways in the literature. You go to the movies, you go to sleep, we talked about Kekulé. He went into a realm that we call these days creative imagination. There's a kind of a mental rest that the problem searcher looks for. Then the classic models go quiet. That area of rest is the unknown, the unlit, the dark, and then we called it the because they don't talk about what it is. And that's what nothing allows us to do. So according to the classic model, there is long struggle, a period of rest, aha of elation, and then scientific verification. You take your insight and you go out there and you look at your experiments or you look at your equations and so forth, and you verify that it was in fact useful.
The effort, sort of the boost at that point, the boost that you get doesn't necessarily mean that you actually escape velocity. You could have it wrong, or you could have had your rocket sort of tilted somewhat so that it's not quite perpendicular to the ground, but you felt compelled to try again and try something new, try a different direction or a different experiment, because you had the genuine hope that this time it was going to be different. It might not have been. It might have led to failure, but you were hopeful that this is something worthwhile to try.
That was something that was worthwhile. I wanted to tell a little story from my own past about insight that is very much akin to this, and it has a little different moral to the tale.
Okay.
When I went to graduate school, I found that I was, throughout the first, I don't know how long anymore, 7 years, some part of that 7 years, I was led by a question of what is the role of intellectual activity in the religious maturation of religious people from around the world. What role does intellectual activity have in that rational activity? It's especially important in the sort of disciplines of the renunciates of the East and so forth, but it's not just that. It's mainly that's where I've looked, not that it's not important elsewhere. So I had this question, and it served sort of like that long process that we talked about as the first step of toward insight. I wrote papers and different angles on it, and always asked this question: well, what is the role of rational activity in religious awakening, you might say? One day, I remember I very consciously took a break from graduate school. And I was just, sometimes graduate school can be a little bit burdensome.
Yeah, of course.
And I just taken a break. And then there was this fellow who used to hang around the graduate school who wasn't really a student. And he used to be a kind of crypto-Buddhist kind of character, would hang out in the coffee shops and so forth. And one day he was showing me, during when I was taking a little bit of rest from my work, and he was showing me some text. I can't remember what text it was even. Some text from the East. He was reading Pali. That's a friend of Sanskrit. He was reading a Pali and then doing the translation, reading the Pali and telling me these different things. And suddenly I had an insight. And the insight was this: I've been looking all this time about the role of rational activity in spiritual and religious awakening. And now I realize there's no way to tell whether you are involved in rational activity or not, because there's no specific function that's specifically rational. You're engaging with the world or with your people around you, or you're engaging with the text that you're involved in, and there's no way to determine whether that's rationality or not. Yeah. So at that moment, I had a very clear insight. And what it did, and this is the interesting why I wanted to tell the story, I didn't get an answer to my question, what the role of in spiritual or religious awakening. What I did was the question disappeared. I no longer had the question.
Good.
And so that's one thing that we also pointed out in our book, is that sometimes the investigations which lead to insight don't give you an answer per se.
Mhm.
What happens is the question itself disappears. That's something that is not often talked about in the realm of science. Although if you look at neuropsychology and this other field that we've talked about with Newberg, with neurotheology and so forth, they will often, and especially if you read The Import of Insight in Artistic Creativity, you'll often hear people talk about the fact that the answer is that the question itself disappears.
Yeah.
So I no longer had that question to lead me through graduate school, which I think that at that moment my graduate career was done, but I still had to do and so forth. But anyway, I just thought I'd tell that story because it's not an answer as you would normally think of it, just the disappearance of the question.
That's a great story. The idea that the religious experience itself be rational, it can only be asked from afar, not by one that's actually having the experience. And it's in sort of observing your friend there, you saw that no longer sort of bothered you, or it just disappeared. It became irrelevant.
It became irrelevant. If I found out that I couldn't determine an answer to that question in terms of experiment. I was thinking about it when we were putting together this book, and I was saying, oh, I remember that.
That's wonderful.
One of the things that's interesting from that story is that it is a classic four-staged insight. And one of the things that we are talking about now in our book is that a more sophisticated way of talking about insight is that it's actually a five-staged process. So let me just quickly go back here. So we've talked about the fact that in the four stages of models of insight, the third stage of when the mind goes quiet or you're resting, they talk about that as the because it's not investigated or not known. And we looked into, as I said, neurotheology, neurobiology, and other neuropsychology, and we found that, in fact, there is a metaconceptual area that we fall into in scientific researching. We talk about that, the area where parallel processing goes on. That means that problem solving goes on in the unconscious. So that we call that the metaconceptual. We elucidated what that means relative to the unconscious and so forth. We also looked at various training processes, disciplines that go on within the religion, and discover that there's not only a metaconceptual realm of the psyche, but there is a realm beyond the psyche itself called the super psyche. And the disciplines, we talked about them from the East and the West, that those disciplines allow one to stay awake in that realm. And in the realm of the super psyche is where nothing is greeted by nothing and so forth. What we pretend is that in the process of coming to insight, the person who is involved in that intensive search, when they enter into what is the unanalyzed realm in most models, we contend that that is the realm of the metaconceptual and of the superpsyche. That what actually brings about true insight and that aha release is an entering into what is beyond thought or what is beyond the psyche itself, into the realm of the metaconceptual or the superconceptual, the superpsyche. We actually say that it's a five-staged process and that it is the exiting from the realm of the metaconceptual or the superpsyche is when the insight actually occurs. And that there's a lot of discussion about why that's an energetic sort of experience. And we have come to the conclusion that it is from the rest of the psyche and the explosion, the dropping of the question, that this release actually occurs. So it's a five-staged process. And so we present a model of intensive work, often aided by images, a period of rest in which you enter into the superpsyche or the metaconceptual. Then there's the period, the outsight, the actual understanding, the energetic understanding, and then again, verification. So what we've tried to do is come out of that dark closet of what people are doing when they're quiet and actually offer an analysis, a psychological analysis. Well, what exactly is going on there? And again, that was given to us as a model because we are guided into it by an understanding of nothing. Just one more thing I just wanted to note, and that is that within the realm of religion, where the disciplines of entering into the superpsyche occur, within the realm of religion, it is the greeting of nothing in the superpsyche that is the point. And that the insights, the outsights that you get after this entering into that greeting, into that we call nihilolative knowing, is actually a kind of secondary thing, a tertiary thing. That's not what's important to the religious discipline. But for scientists, that secondary is actually the point.
The point, yeah.
That's what they want. That outsight is the goal. There's just one more thing I wanted to say. We're entering into a phase of the book where we will be doing quite pointed critique of popularizers of science. And one of the things that we will point out here is that, generally speaking, popularizers of science are ignorant of the metaconceptual. We should also say that we don't rest with just critique. We have a long section at the end of the book where we join with the popularizers of science and put our thoughts together to come up with some pretty nice, pretty interesting and effective analyses of scientific problems. Okay, so that's what it is. We will have a fused model. Cosmologists especially are very enamored with the experience of awe, which we will also analyze and bring into the model. And so this is the first step in building a model of outsight, awe, and this kenosis of self.
Sounds great. I love the aim of science to extract the golden nugget as opposed to just experiencing or inperiencing the nothing as being the goal of the monk or the religious person.
There's something I also I like to think and to say is that the popularizers of science make use of the realms of the metaconceptual and the superpsyche, but they deny their existence. So they take the fruits of nothing, but at the same time denying existence.
We'll go so far as to deny even, yes. Some will just ignore, right? But some will go so far as to deny.
Most are actually just ignore. That's true. That's the realm of the un. I think that's one of our senses, I think, where the popularizers are naive and we have something to tell.
They're naive are the ones that ignore, perhaps, right? But those that deny are misleading because they're holding their own personal baggage or trying to cumber us with their baggage. So I guess we can go to top on pop section. Have the self-described neuroanatomist, Jill Taylor. She's had the opportunity that few brain scientists ever have, which is one morning she realized she was going to have a massive stroke, and as it happened, she felt her brain functions slip away one by one, her speech, her movement, her understanding even. And as she was going through it, she was studying the process and remembered it. It's a powerful story that we wanted to share with you about how our brains connect us to the world and to one another. With that, let me share the screen and play it.
And then I'll get back to my routine. Okay, so I got to call help. I got to call work. I couldn't remember the number at work. So I remembered in my office I had a business card with my number on it. So I go into my business room. I pull out a 3-inch stack of business cards. And I'm looking at the card on top. And even though I could see clearly in my mind's eye what my business card looked like, I couldn't tell if this was my card or not because all I could see were pixels. And the pixels of the words blended with the pixels of the background and the pixels of the symbols, and I just couldn't tell. And then I would wait for what I call a wave of clarity. And in that moment, I would be able to reattach to normal reality. And I could tell, that's not the card, that's not the card, that's not the card. It took me 45 minutes to get 1 inch down inside of that stack of cards. In the meantime, for 45 minutes, the hemorrhage is getting bigger in my left hemisphere. I do not understand numbers. I do not understand a telephone, but it's the only plan I have. So I take the phone pad and I put it right here. I take the business card, I put it right here, and I'm matching the shape of the squiggles on the card to the shape of the squiggles on the phone pad. But then I would drift back out into la la land and not remember when I come back if I'd already dialed those numbers. So I had to wield my paralyzed arm like a stump and cover the numbers as I went along and push them so that as I would come back to normal reality, I'd be able to tell, yes, I've already dialed that number. Eventually, the whole number gets dialed, and I'm listening to the phone, and my colleague picks up the phone, and he says to me, and I think to myself, oh my gosh, he sounds like a golden retriever. And so I say to him, clear in my mind, I say to him, this is Jill, I need help. And what comes out of my voice is, and I think, oh my gosh, I sound like a golden retriever. So I didn't know that I couldn't speak or understand language until I tried. So he recognizes that I need help, and he gets me help. And a little while later, I'm riding in an ambulance from one hospital across Boston to Mass General Hospital, and I curl up into a little fetal ball. And just like a balloon, with the last bit of air just right out of the balloon, I just felt my energy lift, and I felt my spirit surrender. And in that moment, I knew that I was no longer the choreographer of my life, and either the doctors rescue my body and give me a second chance at life, or this was perhaps my moment of transition. When I woke later that afternoon, I was shocked to discover that I was still alive. When I felt my spirit surrender, I said goodbye to my life, and my mind was now suspended between two very opposite planes of reality. Stimulation coming in through my sensory systems felt like pure pain. Light burned my brain like wildfire, and sounds were so loud and chaotic that I could not pick a voice out from the background noise, and I just wanted to escape. Because I could not identify the position of my body in space, I felt enormous and expansive, like a genie just liberated from her bottle. And my spirit soared free like a great whale gliding through a sea of silent euphoria. Nirvana. I found nirvana. And I remember thinking there's no way I would ever be able to squeeze the enormousness of myself back inside this tiny little body. But then I realized, but I'm still alive. I'm still alive, and I have found nirvana. And if I have found nirvana and I'm still alive, then everyone who is alive can find nirvana. And I pictured a world filled with beautiful, peaceful, compassionate, loving people who knew that they could come to this space at any time, and that they could purposely choose to step to the right of their left hemispheres and find this peace. And then I realized what a tremendous gift this experience could be. What a stroke of insight this could be to how we live our lives. And it motivated me to recover.
Okay, let's stop it right there.
Yeah.
Incredible story. And the experience of a stroke, this conflict between the left and right hemispheres of the brain, going on. She's hanging on for life. The right side giving her all these wonderful visions, and the left side was bringing her back to reality, that she needed help. I love the description of when she surrenders, especially, right? And that last little bit of air, she probably meant her lungs, but I sort of visualize that as the last bit of air of her ego, and that she could not identify her moment in space. She became expansive and thought that there was no way that she could squeeze the enormousness of herself all over back into this tiny body. Oh, what a great visual right there. Yeah. Choose to step to the right of the left hemispheres and find this peace. What a stroke of insight could this be, how we live our lives. And then almost under her breath saying that, and it motivated me to recover. She might not have been the choreographer of her life, but it seems like she still had a choice in the matter, which is amazing and insightful. She wanted to live despite the peace she felt in the place she temporarily inhabited, because she wants to help bring others to what she calls nirvana. And I think that's amazing.
She identified with physical healing. She wanted to physically heal in order to tell people what had happened to her. Pretty amazing. The one thing we didn't mention is that she brought her brain out and she folded open the two hemispheres. It was amazing how she interpreted the hemispheric quality, her different experience, and how she went back and forth between them. And so
still very much useful, but she really sort of fell in love with the right side of her brain.
But she also, which is I think a very interesting thing to point out about her experience and what she's done with it since, because she's still an active scientist as far as I know, and she's still working. There have been other reports of this kind of thing where stroke or clots in the brain or tumors in the brain cause an opening for people, and they started to see various ways that they thought the universe worked. And then the story will end with, well, then they found out it was a tumor, and when they took out the tumor, then nothing was occurring for that person in the world in terms of those insights that she had. Whereas she is clearly had been propelled into this understanding of the hemispheres and so forth through her blood clot in the brain.
That's right.
But in fact, since she's healed, she still has very much that worldview continues.
That's right. She still retained that worldview.
You can't just poo-poo it or negate it on the basis of the fact that, well, that was just a brain malfunctioning at a clot. And I think that's what some neuroscientists would try to say. It was just a blood clot that caused that. But she is interesting evidence that that's not the case, I thought.
It's a willingness to sort of see it as something meaningful as opposed to meaningless. That damage in her brain, the images that she saw as a result of that damage could have been, were useful to her to bring her to a state that's ultimately better or has her be more fit moving forward in life. You retain what gives you fitness. This helps further that goal or that telos. And I think that, the scientist that just discards it as meaningless sort of display of images, like it really misses out on something pretty big, something that can be life-changing.
You can tell how she is speaking, that she's very much enamored with and into and disciplined in her presentation to make sure, and she does, by bringing the brain out, I think that's just genius. It roots it in science. If she was to go into this kind of discussion without rooting it in science, it might be seen as hallucinatory, and that her understanding of the bicameral mind was really, I think, really good.
And that's also another reason why, harping on it a little bit, but that why chaoptics could be very, very good for scientists. It grounds it, real set of images that scientists can accept, help inform future investigation, right? It can help give the scientist that maybe otherwise has a difficult time in believing in the meaning of these images, might give them enough of a thread to be able to hold on, to be able to try and say, okay, well, maybe this works. Maybe let's try to experiment and set the rocket and have it sort of go in this direction.
Get beyond their pot bellies. And no, I think you've been bringing in some great chaoptics, and you would have a great discussion with her about chaoptics.
I think so.
She did it not through chaoptic, but through an actual physiological breakdown of the communication between hemispheres. Chaoptic may be a discussion between hemispheres in a certain way. That'd be you probably have a nice talk.
Nice thing to actually sort of dive a little bit deeper into. Yeah, you're right. That's what I have for today.
Yeah, great.
The story is incredible. We're almost at 7 million views. Let's get her up to 10 million views.
Yeah, right.
Everybody should watch it.
Okay, well, best to you and the family.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Entering the Universe has been brought to you by the Society of Namecoin. Until next time. No.